He didn't say it with anger. He said it with a napkin in his lap and a fork in his hand, like he was commenting on the weather. I just can't afford to feed an extra mouth forever, Dad. The roast chicken I'd made sat half-carved between us, still steaming. He didn't touch it again. I looked down at my plate. The peas were going cold. The gravy had begun to congeal around the edges. My appetite vanished so quickly it felt like someone had reached into my chest and switched off a light. "There's a job at the marina," he continued, not looking up. "Wrench work. Good pay. For your age." He said it like he was helping, like he was doing me a favor, like I hadn't worked 47 years and only stopped when my wife's lungs gave out and I couldn't trust myself to leave her alone. My coffee cup was still warm in front of me, the one with the faded red cardinal on it, her favorite. She used to make sure it was clean before I sat down. Now it was mine by default. I nodded, because that's what men like me do when we're given a choice that's already been made. The silence stretched between us like the dock planks he was sending me to. He cleared his throat and stabbed another bite of chicken as if the matter had been settled. But I wasn't chewing, I was remembering. The way my hands used to ache after tuning engines all day. The way she'd greet me at the door with a towel for the grease and a kiss that still smelled of vanilla from her tea. The way I'd said, just for a few months, when I moved in, because the house had been so quiet after she left, and now I was an extra mouth. I smiled because he needed me to smile, because anything less might make him feel guilty, and I've never been the kind of man to pass guilt around like salt at a table. I picked up my fork, swallowed a bite I didn't taste. "The job would start tomorrow," he said. "Down at Pier 6. They'd give me a wrench and a name tag." He went on about hours, pay, how lucky I was. I kept nodding, but in the pit of my stomach something had shifted. Not anger, not yet. Just that cold, unmistakable recognition that something you once believed was solid has started to drift. He thought he was solving a problem. But he didn't know what he was about to set in motion. Not yet. It was a Tuesday. The kind of day that hangs in the middle of the week like an unanswered question. I'd just come in from trimming the hedges. Not because anyone asked, no one did. But because they were overgrown and I didn't like the way they drooped over the walkway like untucked shirt tails. My wife would have noticed that kind of thing. She always liked the place looking tidy, even if we never had guests. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something sharper, vinegar maybe. I stepped out of my shoes by the door like I always did. Still had clippings stuck to my socks. From the kitchen, I heard plates clinking and the low hum of voices. My son's wife, Emily, was at the counter, organizing something in a large tote bag. She looked up when I entered, then down again quick as a flicker. "Oh, hi," she said, smiling in that polite way that lands somewhere between friendliness and formality. "We're heading to the museum tomorrow. Field trip day." She gestured toward the bag like that explained everything. I nodded. "Sounds nice. The kids'll like that." She didn't answer, just reached for a juice box and slipped it into the side pocket of the tote. My grandson Jacob came bounding in from the hallway with untied sneakers and a plastic dinosaur in one hand. Pop, look, he's eating the mail." He jabbed the toy's open-jawed and envelope on the table, giggling. I chuckled, crouched to meet his eyes. "That's federal property, young man. You might go to jail." He laughed harder and launched himself at me. I caught him with a grunt, the kind that comes with older knees and younger grandchildren. From the dining room I heard my son's voice, distracted and loud. "Jacob, come on, leave Grandpa alone. He's tired." "I'm not," I said softly. But it was already past. Emily cleared her throat. "Hey, while you're here, I was wondering, could you move your things out of the guest closet?" I straightened, still holding Jacob, who'd now decided I made a fine jungle gym. My things? Just the boxes, the old tools and jackets. I need the space for trip supplies. It's just temporary. Her voice stayed light, almost breezy, but her eyes flicked toward the hallway. I followed her gaze and saw 2 plastic storage bins already sitting where my boots used to be. I nodded. Sure, I'll take care of it. Great, she said, already turning back to her packing. Jacob slid from my lap and raced down the hallway, dinosaur in tow. I lingered there a second longer. Just long enough to see my coat, the heavy brown one with the patch on the elbow, crammed into a pile beside a stack of empty gift bags. Like it didn't belong. I gathered it up later, back aching from stooping. Carried it down to the garage where the light still flickered overhead. Stacked everything neatly on the shelf near the water heater. Out of the way. That night at dinner, I sat at the far end of the table. The kids were arguing about who got the last biscuit. Emily was cutting their chicken into pieces. My son was on his phone. Something about an invoice, a delivery, I don't know. No one asked about my day. No one noticed the bandage on my thumb from where I'd nicked it pruning the hedge. No one saw that I'd made myself smaller. Moved out of their way. Tidied up after my presence. I passed the salt. I smiled at Jacob when he offered me half his biscuit. And I didn't mention the closet, not because it didn't matter, but because, for the first time, I wasn't sure it would make a difference if it did. The coat didn't fit on the garage shelf. Too thick, too stubborn. It kept sliding off the edge no matter how carefully I folded it. So I finally hung it from a rusted nail above the workbench. The same bench where my son used to help me sort screws into jars when he was Jacob's age. That was 2 weeks ago, and it still hung there. I saw it every morning when I went down to the garage to fetch the paper, out of habit more than necessity. No one read it but me. They got their news from glowing rectangles now, thumb-scrolled and silent. But I liked the feel of it, the crinkle of the pages, the ink that smudged your fingertips. Something about it felt solid, even if the rest of the world didn't. The coat stared at me each day as I passed. Brown wool, worn smooth at the elbows, the left pocket stitched up by my wife's steady hands a decade ago. I hadn't worn it since the day Emily asked me to move my things. No one noticed, no one asked. At breakfast, I'd sit at the end of the table with my mug, the cardinal one, and watch the morning unfold like I was watching a play I'd once been in. Emily made smoothies now, bright green ones. She'd hand one to my son, press one into Jacob's hand, and sometimes pour a third for herself. They'd sip and chatter while I stirred my oatmeal, the same way I had every morning since before Jacob was born. Nobody ever asked if I wanted one. They weren't being cruel. Just busy, preoccupied. That's what I told myself. One morning I reached for the honey in the cupboard and found it missing. When I asked, Emily blinked. Oh, I moved it to the pantry. It was cluttering up the tea shelf. The pantry, behind the gluten-free crackers and seaweed snacks. I found it there eventually, sticky lid and all. That night at dinner I noticed something else. My plate was smaller. It wasn't deliberate, just one of the salad plates instead of the dinner ones. Probably a mix-up in the stack. But no one corrected it. No one reached to swap it out. I ate my meal in silence, cutting chicken into bites that barely fit the tiny plate. No one said a word. The next night it happened again. By the third night I didn't bother saying anything. I just sat at the table with my smaller plate, my smaller portion, my smaller presents. Jacob still smiled at me, still asked me to read bedtime stories when his parents were too tired or too late from work. But even that started to dwindle. We're trying to set a better routine, Emily said one night, gently closing the bedroom door before I could step inside. Thanks, though. I stood in the hallway, book in hand, and nodded. Then walked back to my room, the converted office, and sat on the edge of the daybed. The coat was still in the garage. I hadn't needed it yet, but I missed it anyway, missed its weight, its memory. I started dreaming about it. Not the coat itself, but what it represented. Mornings beside my wife as she stitched the pocket. Her voice humming some old hymn. My son running in with skinned knees and big news about a math test. Those days felt distant now. Once I asked if I could cook dinner. A simple thing. My roast, the one my wife used to call Sunday worthy. Emily hesitated. I think we're doing sheep pan night. Just easier, you know. I nodded. Of course. I peeled carrots anyway, quietly, without being asked, then set them in a bag and left them in the fridge, unlabeled. They were gone the next morning. No comment, no thanks, just gone. I sat with my newspaper, ate my oatmeal, stirred in the honey I'd now memorized the location of, and wondered when I had become background. Not unwanted, not exactly, just no longer necessary. The coat in the garage, unmoved, unclaimed, seemed to know the answer. It was late October, the year my son turned 10. The kind of autumn that made you forget winter was coming. Golden and crisp, with skies so blue it hurt to stare at them too long. We'd spent the afternoon by the water, the two of us. Just me and him. No errands, no schedules, no distractions. Just a father and his boy, and a wooden boat I'd been piecing back together for months. He called it the Lucky One. I never asked why. Maybe because it floated, despite all odds. I remember the way his laughter echoed off the marina pilings when I handed him the tiller and said, "She's all yours, Captain." His hands barely reached both sides, but his chest puffed out like he'd just been named King of the Sea. We didn't go far, just past the marker where the water smelled more like salt than fuel, then drifted for a while, watching the gulls circle overhead. That night back home, we had pot roast and mashed potatoes. My wife lit a candle even though it wasn't a holiday. She said it was for the smell. I think it was for the softness it brought to our kitchen, a gentle kind of light. I hung my coat, that same brown one with the patch on the elbow on the hook near the door. And when I noticed the seam had come loose, I set it on the chair by the sewing basket. "I'll fix it after dinner," she said, wiping gravy off her wrist. And she did. Sat there humming Moon River under her breath, threading the needle with the calm patience that made her hands look younger than mine, even though we were the same age. Our son brought over a flashlight and shone it like a spotlight while she worked, like he was the stagehand to her performance. "Don't blind your mother," I chuckled. "I'm making sure it's even," he said, serious as a judge. When she finished, she turned the coat over and smoothed it across her lap. "There," she said. "Better than new." I reached out and touched the patch. His small fingers tracing the stitch. "It's like armor," he said. "Now you'll never get cold again?" I don't know why that stayed with me. Maybe because of the way she looked at me when he said it. That quiet smile. The one that said, "We've done something right." I wore the coat every winter after that, even when the lining wore thin, even when the zipper broke and I had to rig a button just to keep the wind out. I wore it to work, to church, to the grocery store. I wore it the day I signed the retirement papers. I wore it the night she took her last breath, holding my hand so tight I thought it might never be warm again. I wore it because it was part of me, part of us. And now it hangs in the garage, unworn, forgotten, like I nearly was. The marina job starts tomorrow, and I know already I'll wear that coat. Not because it's warm, though it is, but because it remembers me, even when others don't. The night before I started at the marina, I cooked dinner. Not out of obligation. No one asked me to. But the kitchen was empty, and the silence in the house felt softer than usual. So I peeled the carrots I'd left in the fridge days earlier. Rubbed herbs into 2 chicken breasts. Mashed potatoes with the hand mixer that still sputtered at low speed. I set the table like I used to. 4 plates, not 3, because that's how I'd always done it. Folded napkins, forks on the left, wine glasses even if we'd only be drinking water. It felt good, familiar. The coat still hung in the garage waiting. Tonight I wore a flannel shirt she'd bought me years ago. The one with buttons so stubborn you had to fight them like bad thoughts. I was just finishing when the front door opened. Voices, laughter. Emily and my son, arms full of grocery bags, the scent of coffee trailing in with the wind. They stopped when they saw the table. "Oh," Emily said. My son raised an eyebrow. "What's all of this?" "Dinner," I said simply. "Thought it might be nice before tomorrow." He nodded slowly. "You didn't have to do all this, Dad." "I know." Emily touched the edge of a napkin. "It smells good." That was all. They put the groceries away without much fuss, murmuring to each other in the low, efficient way people do when they've lived together long enough to skip whole sentences. We sat down, me at the head of the table, them across from each other. Jacob was at a friend's house for a sleepover. 3 chairs filled, 1 left empty. They ate politely. We talked lightly about the weather, the marina, how early I'd need to leave. My son mentioned something about tides, though he'd never been on a boat longer than a paddleboard. No one said it, but I knew what they were doing, being kind, and I was grateful for it, truly. Halfway through the meal, Emily reached for the salt. Her sleeve brushed the candlestick in the center of the table, one of the old brass ones from my wife's collection. It tipped, wobbled, and for a moment I thought she'd catch it. She didn't. It fell with a soft clink, rolling against the gravy boat. The candle, still lit, flickered violently, then went out. "Oh, shoot," she said, catching the brass in her hand. "Sorry about that." I smiled. "It's all right." She set it upright, unlit. No one reached for the matches. The table dimmed slightly, just enough to notice. A few minutes later, she began gathering plates. I wasn't done, but I moved my fork aside. My son stood. "Early morning, huh?" I nodded. "Yeah." Emily smiled at me, not unkindly, but already half turned toward the dishwasher. "Good luck tomorrow, Mr. Fix-It." "Thanks." They disappeared into the kitchen. I heard the rush of water, the clatter of plates, soft laughter between them. The kind of laughter you don't want to interrupt. I sat a moment longer, just me, the empty chair, the unlit candle, and the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I'd mistaken courtesy for care. I carried my plate to the sink, washed it myself, and that night, as I passed the coat in the garage on my way to bed, I paused, brushed a bit of lint from the shoulder. Then I turned off the light. The coat stayed in the dark, and so did that little flicker of hope. That morning, the house was still asleep when I slipped out the door. Not that anyone noticed. No goodbye. No good luck. Just the creak of the front steps and the porch light flickering off behind me. The marina sat at the edge of town, past the diner with the broken neon sign and the row of motels that smelled like seaweed and old newspapers. I walked the last few blocks instead of waiting for the bus transfer. My legs needed to move, even if they complained with every step. I arrived early, too early. The boats hadn't begun to stir yet. The air tasted like salt and diesel. Ropes creaked against wooden pylons. Gulls barked at nothing. The foreman hadn't arrived, so I sat on an overturned bucket by the edge of the pier, jacket zipped to the collar, hands buried deep in my pockets. Inside one pocket was a spoon. I don't know why I'd taken it. Maybe because it was the only thing in the drawer that hadn't moved. The same old stainless steel dessert spoon, with a slight bend near the tip. Warped years ago when it got caught in the garbage disposal. My wife used to laugh about it, Still good for pudding, she'd say. I carried it with me now, slipped it into my coat like a charm. But sitting there in the gray chill of morning, that spoon in my pocket felt heavier than anything I'd ever lifted, like proof of how far I'd fallen. A spoon, not a photo, not a letter, not a token of love. Just a bent piece of metal no one had noticed was missing. That's what I was now. Something bent, something once useful, now mostly in the way. I watched the water lap against the dock, steady and indifferent. Thought of all the things I'd done. Decades of work, of fixing, of lifting others up. Thought of the dinners I cooked that went uneaten. The birthdays spent in silence. The nights listening to laughter from behind closed doors. I was tired, not in the way sleep fixes, deeper than that. A tiredness that sits behind your eyes and stays there like a shadow. My hands, once sure and strong, trembled slightly as I reached for a thermos of coffee I'd packed myself. No one had asked if I'd wanted a travel mug. No one had offered to pack a lunch. I unscrewed the lid, took a sip. Cold already. Even the coffee had given up. And that's when it hit me. Not a sharp pain, not anger, just this. Hollow settling, like a drawer closing softly after years of being stuck open. I was invisible, and worse, I was beginning to believe I deserved it. That maybe this was just the way things end for people like me. Quietly, without fanfare, with a coat hung in a garage and a bent spoon in a pocket, watching the tide come in. The foreman arrived 20 minutes later. He was kind enough, gave me a wrench, showed me a few assignments, didn't ask questions, didn't notice the tremble in my hands or the slouch in my shoulders. That was fine. I worked in silence. Bolts, hoses, rusted clamps. My hands remembered more than I did. But even as I turned the wrench and listened to the engine sputter back to life, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was patching something far more broken than any boat. That night, back home, the house was loud again, TV on. Jacob shouting upstairs, Emily asking what smelled like fish. No one asked how my first day was. I said nothing. Went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, pulled the spoon from my pocket, held it in my palm like a secret, like a scar. On the 5th day, I polished the wrench, not because it was dirty, not because anyone asked me to, but because it felt good to see it shine. The other mechanics, boys mostly, all knees and noise, left there scattered on benches, crusted in oil, nicked from carelessness. They worked like they were racing the clock, fast hands, faster mouths. One of them, Charlie, dropped a ratchet into the water on his 2nd day, laughed about it like it was a rite of passage. But me, I worked slowly, deliberately. That morning, I'd fixed an outboard motor that had stumped 2 of them. I didn't gloat. I didn't explain. I just bent down, tightened what needed tightening, and coaxed the thing back to life with patience and a little spit on the gasket. When it rumbled to life, steady and smooth, they stared like I'd cast a spell. I didn't smile, not outwardly. But something in me, something long quiet, stirred. That night, I went back to the garage for the coat. It was late, house dark, wind pressing gently against the windows. I stood under the flickering bulb, staring at that brown wool shape hanging from the rusted nail. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't just see a relic. I saw a man, not a burden, not an extra mouth, not someone taking up space. I reached into the pocket and pulled out the spoon, held it in my hand again, turned it over slowly, tracing the warped edge. And then, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I walked to the sink, filled a bowl with hot water, and dropped it in. Watched it sink, watched the bubbles rise. Then I sat, waited, and when the metal was warm enough, I wrapped it in a dish towel, pressed it gently against the edge of the counter, and slowly, carefully began to bend it back. It didn't straighten perfectly, but it came close. And as I stood there, alone in the kitchen, holding that newly bent-back spoon in my hand, I felt something subtle shift. Not rage, not bitterness, just a line drawn. A quiet decision. They could ignore my voice at dinner. They could forget my stories, dismiss my rituals, box up my memories and stuff them in garage corners. But I wasn't disappearing. Not all the way. I still had something left. Something sharp and real and mine. And I'd start with this. With the shine on my tools. The steady hum of engines returning to life. The acquired reputation already beginning to grow along the docks. Old guy knows his stuff. One of the boys had muttered that afternoon. Real clean work. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes something is all a man needs to begin again. Saturday morning, the marina was still. No engines yet. No shouts across the dock. Just the low groan of tide against pylons and the slap of water against hulls. I arrived early again. But this time, I didn't head to the workshop. I walked. Down the far end of the pier, past the workboats and skiffs, past the aluminum hulls and some bleached pontoons, toward the private slips. The ones with names painted in gold and navy, with lines so clean you could shave with them. And I wasn't supposed to be there. This wasn't my territory. But I went anyway. My boots thudded softly against the planks. The morning sun filtered through a mist that hadn't yet lifted, and the water glimmered like silver coins tossed carelessly into a wishing well. At the end of the dock, she waited. My boat. Not by name, not anymore. But I'd have known her anywhere. Same bow curve, same stern line. She'd been refitted, repainted, made into something sleeker. But she was mine. I could see it in the way she sat in the water, proud and balanced like a woman who knew her worth. I stepped aboard. The deck creaked under my weight, a familiar groan, half protest, half greeting. I didn't ask for permission, didn't call anyone, just stood there, hand on the rail, letting the memory of varnish and salt wrap itself around me like an old coat. The wheel still had the worn nick from where my wedding band used to catch. I ran my thumb over it, then I sat. Not in a rush, not to work, just to be. The gulls cried above. The fog thinned. I pulled the spoon from my coat pocket, the same one I'd straightened days ago, and set it gently on the deck beside me. It caught the morning light, gleaming like something new. I didn't need it anymore. It had done its job. Let them keep their routines, their quiet dismissals, their blind eyes. I wasn't asking to be seen now. I was simply claiming what was already mine. Not the boat, maybe, not by deed or paper, but the feeling, the knowing. This is who I am. A man who builds, who fixes, who remembers every seal and screw and turn of the wheel. I heard footsteps behind me, slow, cautious. I didn't turn. "Morning," a voice said. Polished shoes, pressed slacks, a blazer that didn't belong near oil or sea. "You the one who got that Mercury running?" he asked. I nodded. He whistled. "No one's touched that engine in years. You did good work." Still, I said nothing. Then he gestured to the boat beneath us. "How would you feel about something bigger?" And I smiled. Not because I needed the offer, but because I'd already taken the first step. By walking out here, by stepping aboard, by remembering who I was before I became an extra mouth. The sun had begun to sink when I came home that evening. The sky was a watercolor, streaks of peach and lavender brushing the tops of the trees. The house was quiet, but not the kind that invited peace. Just quiet in the way an unused room is quiet. Jacob's shoes were by the door, one upside down. Emily's coat hung on the stair rail again, even though she asked everyone else to use the closet. My son's voice drifted from the kitchen. Something about his schedule, the car needing a new filter, the price of produce. I listened from the entryway, invisible by habit now. I didn't speak. I didn't unpack my things. I just walked down to the garage. The light flicked on with its usual delay. That familiar flicker. The one I've been meaning to fix but hadn't. My coat still hung where it always had. Only now, the weight of it didn't feel burdensome. It felt earned. I reached into the pocket and pulled out the spoon. Warm from my hand. Smooth from years of use. Bent, then straightened, then bent again. Not perfectly, but purposefully. It had traveled with me from invisibility to decision, a symbol of care no one asked for, a relic of meals long past, of patience unreturned, of the smallest acts of hope. And now, it was ready to rest. I walked to the shelf over the workbench, the one lined with mason jars of screws and oil-stained rags. I moved aside an old wrench, wiped a clean spot with my sleeve, and laid the spoon down gently, not hidden, not thrown away, just placed, as if to say, I was here, and I mattered, and I don't need to ask for room anymore. Upstairs a door opened, a laugh, a microwave beeped. But I stayed in the garage for a while longer, letting the silence fill me, not with ache, but with certainty. I was done waiting to be invited into spaces I had helped build. From now on, I would make my own. The spoon caught the light one last time as I turned to leave. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. I'd already spoken, clearly, quietly, in the only language that ever mattered. Action. The days fell into rhythm after that. I rose early, before the coffee finished its slow drip, packed my own lunch, stretched my back on the porch while the sun lifted itself over the rooftops like it, too, had something worth doing. At the marina, I became a fixture. Not the kind that collects dust, but the kind people lean on. A problem with a rudder? Ask the old guy. Need a gasket matched from memory? He's got it. I didn't talk much. I didn't need to. My hands spoke for me. The man in the navy blazer came back, just like he said he would. His name was Malcolm. Clean shoes, careful voice, the kind of man who remembered where to pause in a sentence. He asked if I'd stay on longer term, help maintain the yacht. Said the owner had been impressed. Though, of course, I never said I'd once stood on her deck, not as a hired hand, but as the captain of my own story. I nodded. I said I'd consider it. And then I came back the next day. Not because I needed the work, not really, but because I'd remembered something. How it felt to be good at something. How it felt to be needed for more than just my silence, my patience, or the space I didn't take up. There was power in that. Not loud power, not the kind that demands, but the kind that holds steady when others drift. At home, things didn't change much. Emily still asked if I'd mind picking up milk. My son still left his shoes by the door. Jacob still ran to me on the good days and walked past me on the others. But I didn't wait to be seen anymore. I made dinner when I wanted to, ate when I didn't. Sometimes I'd walk down to the harbor after my shift and sit at the edge of the pier. Watch the sun lower itself into the bay, slow and certain, like it had nothing to prove. I thought of her then. My wife. How she used to hum while she sewed. How she once patched the coat I still wore every morning. The one whose elbow now had 2 more stitches. Mine this time. Not as neat, but strong. And I thought of that night at the table. The candle knocked over, the light never relit. How I'd stayed seated, letting the darkness grow, waiting for something, anything that didn't come. That was the last night I waited. Now I lit my own candle if I wanted light, and sometimes I didn't. Sometimes I liked the dark. It made the stars clearer. The spoon stayed on the shelf in the garage, right where I left it. I saw it every evening when I got home, the metal now dulled from salt air and quiet resolve. No one touched it. No one asked about it. It didn't matter. It wasn't for them. It was for me. A reminder that I had bent, yes, bent with age, with grief, with years of being small. But I hadn't broken. One Sunday, I took Jacob with me to the marina. Just us. He asked 100 questions, ran his hands along the railings, climbed into the old cabin like it was a fort. You know a lot about boats, Pop-Pop. I looked at him, his face still soft with childhood. I do. He paused, thoughtful. Did you always? I nodded. Longer than you've been alive. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You should teach me. And just like that, with one sentence, unpracticed and pure, the ache in my chest loosened. I didn't need to say yes. I just reached for a rope, handed it to him, and began. Not with instructions, but with a story. About a boat once called the Lucky One. About a boy who took the tiller and a man who led him. And about how sometimes, when the tide carries you out farther than you planned, you learn to steer by the stars. That night, I sat alone on the porch as the sky turned the deep color of ink. No one came to ask if I was all right. No one needed to. I was. The air smelled like salt and memory. And in my pocket, not my coat this time, but my shirt, I found something I'd almost forgotten. A small slip of paper, the one I'd tucked in weeks ago. A note my wife had written years before, back when I was still working, still running, still hers. It was creased and yellowed now, the ink faded but legible. You are not an extra mouth, it read. You are the reason this house ever had a table. I held it for a long time. Then I folded it back, not out of sight, just close to the heart. And I whispered into the quiet, to no one and everyone. I remember now.